Hi, everybody, and welcome to TNMCoaching Unplugged. Today, I'm joined with Kasper Lundby Jolberg, an insightful psychologist, coach, leadership expert, and the co-author of The Courageous Consultant. With nearly 2 decades of experience supporting leaders and teams across Danish and international organizations, Kasper specializes in emotionally intelligent leadership and deep dynamics that shape human collaboration. This is the real conversation. And in this conversation, we're going to dive into what does it mean to lead with courage? What does it mean to consult with courage? What does it mean to move beyond surface into vulnerability, emotional intelligence, deep self-awareness that will inspire profound leadership and consulting as well? Kasper is inviting us to go into the source, to face our fears, to become courageous, to embrace power of the presence when we consult and lead. Kasper, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Zoran, for having me. And thank you for the kind words. I will try to live up to your expectations and those of our audience, and also embody being courageous myself as we go through this coffee chat and podcast.
Exactly. I think that this courageousness is always amazing for all of us. How can we embody that in our real life? And sometimes when we show up in a podcast like this, as you said, we have to embody and live up to our own expectations, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So to start with, my first question to you is when you look into your life, because our audience always wants to know a little bit more about yourself, a little bit more about your journey, a little bit more about your life. What inspired you to kind of blend psychology, leadership, consulting, and what inspired you to co-write the book of Courageous Consultant?
Well, to answer your first question and allow me to be a bit personal and go back a while to my own upbringing, because I am a psychologist after all. So looking at the psychology part of what I do, I think there's both an emotional driver for me and an intellectual quest for me. In terms of the emotional driver, well, looking back at my own upbringing and my own childhood, I was the mediator between my parents in their oftentimes dysfunctional marriage. So, I think many in HR and for certain many in psychology have kind of that helper gene. So for me, I guess that came from wanting to help them. It served me well in some contexts, and sometimes, and we'll get back to how that influences how we are today as consultants and leaders. Sometimes it takes over and it becomes too forceful of a need and want to help others. But it's definitely part of my psychological makeup. And secondly, it's also about for me to wanting to understand my reasons for my own emotional reactions. I was a rather sensitive child, I think. So I found out that it actually made it easier to accept my own feeling and to kind of contain them if I understood what caused them and was able to label them. So that's what I help leaders do. But it's also, you could say, made it quite obvious to turn to psychology. Sometimes an intellectual defense mechanism, but also sometimes as a intellectual quest. So I think in terms of the intellectual quest, I have this engineer-like interest for what makes people tick and what makes relationships work. And I really want to understand how I get the most out of my own strengths and weaknesses. And on top of that, my father had a bachelor's degree in psychology, and my mother was very inspired by Jung and Freud in her work. So I wrote a thesis or a paper in sixth grade on Freud, which
Wow.
was kind of an early indicator of a passion and an interest.
Wow.
In terms of leadership, to add to the psychology interest, I think what made me pick that topic is one that I was sensitive to the dynamics of groups, so wanting to understand what's going on here. Also feeling the agony of wanting to take leadership in some settings, but not always getting followership. So that made me naturally interested in what's kind of going on. I know I'm bringing the best idea. I was kind of top of my class. I came up with good suggestions and solutions back in the day, in terms of this is the right answer, the right solution. And sometimes I found out, well, it's not enough to have the best or at least a good idea and solution. You also need to involve people and engage people and So I think in that dynamic, I wondered what makes me succeed sometimes and not at other times. And the consulting part it's been my professional life and vocation in terms of both being an external consultant and an internal consultant. Now I'm even a people manager myself, which is taking my own medicine, or trying to at least. So I know the kind of the painful place and being between a rock and a hard place when you're a leader trying to practice what I preach. And in terms of what inspired my co-authors and me to write The Courageous Consultant was also about some of my co-authors actually already wrote a book on being a courageous or fearless leader. So that was not an option. I would have loved to write that book, because even though the name and kind of the positioning of this book is in terms of being a courageous consultant, it's also for leaders, employees, colleagues, parents, human beings as such. So I hope people will take an interest in it, even if they're not a consultant.
Yeah, because even if they're not a consultant, there's so much inside of it that will inspire us to become a better human being and a better leader and a better collaborator on all different areas. It's not only relevant to consultants, and this is the reason why I love, your body of your work. So talking about courage, and talking about fearlessness, and talking about something that this is the quality that we all have to show up in this world now more than ever before. When I talk to the leaders, when I coach myself and I see the world unfolding in front of us, I think that's one of the key qualities that is absolutely necessary for all of us to be able to embody in our everyday life, in our everyday work. And it's not easy, right? To be courageous, to be fearless is not easy. So from your experience, what do you feel and how do you think we should go about that as leaders, as professionals, to embody a little bit more of that courage, of that fearlessness? What is necessary for us to be able to display those qualities at this moment in time?
Well, first, I think we should separate fearlessness from courage. This was a discussion I had with my co-authors, because their first two books were called The Fearless Leader and The Fearless Leadership Team. And my stance and my argument was, well, if you're fearless, you don't need courage. Courage is only necessary and applicable when you're facing adversity and difficult situations that activate you and your fear. So I like the courageous part, because that's something we all need in our lives. And I guess it's kind of in many ways a constant, because you also needed courage to kind of go out and hunt down saber-toothed tigers. We need courage facing enemies, imagined or actual, even in war, as we unfortunately see a lot of today. So courage is always important. I think the reason it kind of has an increase in attention these days in terms of leadership goes hand in hand with authenticity. But when you don't separate who you are as a private person that much from who you are as a professional person, when those two overlap more and kind of the boundary between the two becomes more permeable, then you're more on the line and at stake. And being a consultant, also being a leader, is being a helper. That's how I see it. Okay. And being a helper is engaging with others, which means putting yourself on the line, having something at stake, taking interpersonal risk. So for most, if not all of us, that does require some courage. But it's of course different what triggers us from one person to the other. But when we're triggered, whatever baggage we're carrying and however our reactions show up for us individually, then it calls for courage. Which to me, as I mentioned, is kind of married with or coexisting with the need for authenticity. And I think that is due to also, companies and kind of HR and culture turning towards, as I mentioned, less boundaries. But I think whether you're a consultant or a leader or whatever role, then being adaptive and kind of flexible, agile in your professional life, that means being able to read the needs of clients, of colleagues, of employees, and also the demands of the situation. Instead of defining both in terms of what how you look good or how you feel good. So you need to live with that tension sometimes between kind of what is preferable and comfortable to you and what is needed in the situation, what it calls.
And I love that you're bringing this level of authenticity, because for me, this vulnerability, authenticity, and courage, as you said, they go really well together. Because as you said, if you're willing to blur the lines between your personal life and your professional persona, and you're willing to be a little bit more authentic and real in your collaborations and communication, then people can open up a bit more. And I also love the notion that the consultants and leaders are helpers. I think sometimes, especially leaders, they forget that. They think they're leading the way, right? And they're here to show the way, but they forget that one of the vital function of that is helping other people to succeed as well. And for that also, they need to be a little bit more authentic and courageous and vulnerable to engage, fully without any defense mechanisms. You mentioned fear, and I know that you have a great experience in working across, different businesses, internationally, nationally. So what is the core fear that people are struggling with in organizational setting? When you look into this, when you look into the leaders, when you look into yourself, is it fear of not being good enough? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it high expectation? What is it that we're struggling with?
Yeah. Well, I think imposter syndrome is a kind of a phenomenon that encapsulates both certain experiences of fear, but also combined with certain life experiences. So both when it comes to insecure overachievers, which is also has been the recruitment strategy of certain management companies, and imposter syndrome, then, and I'm sure other kind of concepts and words and books will be written and made on various versions. But what I've always been interested is that when you cut away all that kind of surface level variability, then underneath there are some core fears and some core needs. So for me to start with that core need, well, what I think is important to see here is to say is, well, we all basically want to be important to someone, to be significant, to be appreciated and included, which goes very well hand in hand, I think, with the focus on inclusion and belonging these days. So you could say that need for being important and significant is one of the needs I often see play out, and then it plays out in various ways for people in terms of behavior. But that can trigger, if you're a consultant or a leader, you are also a boundary spanner. You're part of the group, but you're not. If you're an external consultant, you go in, you deliver something, and you retract, you withdraw, leave them to do their thing. I found that to be lonely sometimes myself when I was an external consultant, and was part of the reason why I joined kind of on the inside of companies. You have the same dynamic as a leader. You are given some significance and importance naturally due to your position, which I think attracts some leaders. And at the same time, there are certain events and, informal coffee chats that you're just not invited for anymore. So that can be kind of tough on you. And I've spoken as a leadership consultant to many leaders who have struggled with that, in particular if they kind of was what is called sometimes a promoted sibling. So they were a colleague before, and then they're promoted into a leadership position, and suddenly their relationship changes in the group. So one of the fears is being ignored, feeling insignificant, irrelevant. We can come back to the coping strategies. Another basic need we have is the need for feeling some level of competence, self-determination, and control. So that can also play out. Sometimes we're afraid, back to the imposter syndrome, of being called out, of not being good enough, and that can then trigger a fear of incompetence or humiliation, which can then trigger various less productive behaviors. And finally, probably less kind of pronounced in a working context, but still we have a need for feeling loved and liked. Loved is a strong word in a working context, in some companies at least. There's a culture aspect there as well, right? But being appreciated and seen for who you are. So one thing is being significant and people include you. Another one is it okay for you to be you and show up authentically and feeling the psychological safety to be all that you are? So sometimes that can trigger fear of being rejected or unlovable if nobody is interested in who you are as a person. So these are the three basic needs: wanting to be significant or important, wanting to be competent, and wanting to be accepted and loved or liked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really love that you got to the source. Sometimes, people don't think about the real source. And this is the reason why I love that you're on our podcast, because we don't have time to think about this. We don't have time even to feel our needs, and let alone understand what is driving our behavior, because the whole interesting phenomena about those needs, for the people who are not familiar, that never explored the landscape of psychology, is that those needs will drive your behavior. They will drive your thoughts. They will drive your emotional body as well. And as a result of those needs not being fulfilled or expressed, you will show up in a work context in a certain way. So
it actually also it speaks back to our common foundation as human beings. So what I've found is that it's very strong in interventions. Say you have a leader and another leader or an employee that are conflicting and struggling. They have power moves and confrontation. And so at surface level, at behavior level, kind of what's going on is complex and very kind of different from one to the other. But when you peel away that and you say you both want to be perceived as competent, you want to feel some balance between self-determination and control, then they can relate to each other in a different way. They can see kind of their commonalities instead of their differences and conflicting interests. So that's why I like going to the source, because it's kind of a common denominator for all of us.
Exactly. And it resolves, right? With the example that you gave us, if you go to the source in the common denominator, it resolves the conflict, it diffuses the conflict, and then the power struggle disappears. Do you feel that people in the organizational settings can fulfill those needs by working in the organization? Do you feel that, for example, a lot of organizations are fostering the culture when, let's go with the need to be appreciated who I am, right? So I'm unique. I have unique set of skills and talents. I have competencies. Of course, I have my own psychological issues. Everybody does. We all work in progress. But I am showing up in my work, and I have a need to be appreciated, honored, regarded. Do you feel that we're at that stage in our society, in our corporate culture, when people can feel enough of psychological safety that the organization itself will give them the space to fulfill those needs? What is your understanding of that?
Well, it differs from company to company. And that is why culture is so important. And culture is a competitive differentiator, because the companies that get this right are more attractive and more enabling and supportive of performance and talent and retention. So I see it as an important. That's why D&I has been such a great thing. Is, of course, there's the moral side, the values, the ethics, and on the other side, there's kind of companies realizing how it also boosts performance and attractiveness as an employer, and that's because it speaks to basic human needs. I think, and that's kind of a main point in our book, that everything needs to be done kind of as a balancing act and some with some moderation. So I think great companies are companies where you can have psychological safety and show up with what you are, who you are, that part of it which is relevant to the job and the situation. Because I think what people sometimes misunderstand about psychological safety and about authenticity is, if you expect to be met on your individual need, and we're in a time of individualism, and this is the flip side of that. If you think, and right now I'm also interviewing a lot of rather young job candidates for some positions, and you can see also that generational shift. So what I'm looking for is someone who are able to stand by themselves, but also and articulate what they need and how they feel, but also able to regulate their own feelings and not just kind of project their feelings and fears into the surroundings and expect others to deal with them, because that would be a chaotic workplace. So so what I kind of argue for is to find that place in you that is a place of balance and a place of situational awareness as well as self-awareness.
I love that, the balancing act. And, I'm happy that you mentioned the younger generation, due to the social media, the digitalization of everything, there is a different psychological type of what they expect the workplace to be. So it's require a little bit of leveling. And I love that you mentioned that this is the balancing act, so to say. So some companies are ready, some companies are not. Some companies have the sweet cultures when people can be themselves, and some companies, they need to work on it. Because I really think that when people can be themselves, if we co-create that level of culture, that, I can show up with my full spectrum of who I am, owning myself, of course, Kasper, knowing how to self-regulate, not projecting my fears into the team, into the field, being responsible, grown-up adult, the company, and you can thrive within the organization. You mentioned so different needs, when they're not met, for example, or people feeling important, significant, appreciated, and then feeling ignored, forgotten. As you said, I love this term, that you mentioned, when they promote themselves and they become a sibling who is not welcome to the party any longer. What are the coping mechanisms? What would you say to people if they find themselves in these situations when something is not right, the needs are being ignored, and now they have to cope, self-regulate? What would be your advice to them?
I think the first step is to monitor your bodily reactions to different and difficult situations in particular. So that's what some people call internal awareness. So what's going on in me? And then secondly, when you're tense or anxious, fearful, be self-compassionate. Accept that discomfort. It's kind of triggered by something in the present that triggers either kind of old trauma, and here I'm talking about what is sometimes called the little t, so not big traumas, but kind of the scars we've had throughout life. So kind of we have a kind of sore toe that is being stepped on. So and it makes us worry about the future and worry about face saving. So in that situation, trying to be self-compassionate and return mindfully to the now rather than worrying about the future and other people's perceptions. And then what you can do beforehand to kind of prevent such situations escalating is to work, practice, and experiment with alternative behavioral strategies. Because I think when we are triggered and when we are getting emotional, it's oftentimes too late to de-escalate and turn away from our usual coping strategies, defense mechanisms, derailment behaviors. So instead, what we in that context can do is that's back to the bodily reactions. Try to find out before we're in red, maybe we're in yellow. Where is this turning? And then have alternate behavioral strategies ready for de-escalating. Being self-compassionate is one. Having prepared what to say in a certain situation. Maybe if you're courageous, and that's what I'm advocating, being more open about kind of what you're experiencing in the now. We know as consultants how strong intervention it is to kind of say, right now I'm experiencing that everybody's speaking and nobody's listening. I wonder what's going on. What does it feel like on the inside right now? What are you worrying about? Let's take a worry round. Or what is your individual goal and need right now? What are you trying to achieve? So you find ways of steering out of or de-escalating those situations before you're not able to, because you're not able to, in psychology you call it mentalize. So you basically react on impulse and not on mindful deliberation and consideration.
It's wonderful to listen to you, and I think that you're introducing us to the skills as well of the self-management, self-regulation. And I know this is one of the core themes of your book, that consultants, leaders, they are learning how to start self-regulating and owning their inner world more skillfully, especially in the high stake situation when we are emotionally charged. We all under a lot of pressure right now. World is speeding up, so we are all stretched, right? And we are pushed in so many different directions all the time. I think that we all are struggling collectively. I haven't met anybody who is working who says, I have so much time, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm so bored, let me read my book, or let me watch the podcasts during my working hours because I don't have anything else to do. So I think that we all stretched, and I think this practice of self-mastery and self-regulation, right, knowing yourself more, it's really, really important skill. Now, the last topic I would really love to ask you, because that's something that I'm also passionate about and something that I'm talking about a lot in the podcast. And sometimes people react to this in a good way. Sometimes people think, how do I do this? And this whole thing is vulnerability. And for me, just to kind of scope it for you and the audience, I believe that vulnerability is superpower. I feel personally that there is a distinction between, being vulnerable and being strong, and that the vulnerability can bring the strength to the table. But a lot of the times, I'm still observing, leaders that I'm part of, the management groups that I'm part of, even consultants that I'm working with, they somehow don't want to be vulnerable. They somehow want to hide the vulnerability. They somehow want to show up as a super powerful, super strong, super confident, super taking care, you know what I mean? So, and I keep on saying to the leaders, there is one element that we all have to live more and better, which is vulnerability. So tell me a little bit more about your understanding of why is that important, because you mentioned it in your book as well, and how can we become better in that?
Yeah. It's something I've been discussing a lot with my co-psychologists and co-professionals, peers, because right now there is a trend towards vulnerability. And I think it's important to be very specific about what type of vulnerability are we talking about. Because I think there's a certain element to, in the current discourse, some people read it right and are strategically vulnerable, and others are, back to what we talked about before, just maybe being overly vulnerable to the point where they are asking others to take the responsibility for their feelings. So it is a term that can be misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm.
What is great about vulnerability, and the first step in that, is recognizing your own vulnerability. And if you're not willing or able to do that, I think it's a defense mechanism. And then you need to dig. Why did I develop that coping strategy? What can I do to challenge or dismantle it? So recognizing your own vulnerability will give you, as we talked about before, an indicator of when am I triggered, so I am less productive. So that's for one. But what's great about sharing vulnerability, when you take ownership and accountability for your feelings, so you're not using it to blame others, point fingers, but you're using it to inform others of important information about your current state and how you're impacted by the work and the collaboration, then it's, so important, because vulnerability rubs off. So it's like emotional contagion. Openness and transparency are contagious, just as distrust and dishonesty are, right? So having that vulnerability and sharing it as a consultant, and that's what we write about in the book, but also as a leader, to a certain extent, is conducive of others, because you're a role model. So you're setting an example of having an kind of real talk, heartfelt talk, because there's a lot of management BS and a lot of impression management going on, and it actually takes away from performance ultimately, right? Because you don't get all the facts on the table. And for me, that's what emotions are. They're facts. So if you're not willing to recognize it, or you're not willing to share it, then you miss out on important information about the team, the organization that you need to manage. I think what I've found sometimes is that people think that trust is kind of the problem, and I'd say it's the symptom, and the problem is openness. And everybody sits around, or I mean that's synonymous with sharing vulnerability, right? So people sit around and wait for the trust to increase, so they feel comfortable sharing their vulnerability. And I would say, well, I dare you. That's where courage needs to kind of kick in. You need to go first. If you're a leader, you're setting the standard in terms of vulnerability. If you're a consultant, you can use it strategically to make others more comfortable sharing. If you have issues with wanting to seem popular or competent all the time, or being afraid of not being liked for being you, then you hold back or you overcompensate, and then you're not a good role model, and it rubs off, and you get a vicious circle, right?
Right. We can talk forever.
I'm sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, but
it's an important topic, right? So
there's so much wealth of knowledge inside of you, and I'm super grateful, for everything that you share. I mean, I can just to recap of the audience. We're going to do the recap in the description of the podcast. There's so many beautiful golden nuggets from your wisdom. I'm super grateful to you, Kasper, because as I said, you go to the source, you go what matters, you talk about what is right. And what I love about vulnerability of framing, it's amazing that we do need to be accountable for our emotions, right? And we need to be in ownership of how we feel, and then we can be vulnerable. And I love what you said about, being open versus waiting for the culture of trust to emerge so that you can be open and vulnerable. I mean, this is just me bookmarking for the audience to hear that, because I really, really love what you shared so far. So to wrap up, Kasper, how would you love to leave audience with? Any call for action, anything that you believe it's important for people to consider, take forward, think about, practice as a result of our conversation today?
Yeah, I think next time that you feel tense or uncomfortable, or your heart is palpitating, or you're sweating, whatever your tells and signs are that you're kind of distressed to some extent, and you want to avoid the situation or ignore that subjective visceral feeling, then slow down, take a deep breath, rewind a few seconds, and go over what just happened. What led up to this feeling? What preceded this bodily reaction? What was your fear? So I want people to see if, and sometimes what kind of emerges is not a clear-cut fear, but then it needs a bit more exploration. So catastrophe thoughts, as it's called in the cognitive therapy. So what were your worries, basically? And then try to translate that fear into a need. What was the underlying need that you were afraid of wouldn't be met in that situation? And then when you have that need, then you can consider, are there other ways either to calm that need? Is it realistic and proportional with the situation? Or is this my baggage kind of pulling me down, influencing my perception and interpretation of the situation? And are there ways, behavioral strategies that are more productive than my current ones, where I can either be vulnerable and share in a non-criticizing way, or find other workarounds in that situation? But yeah, be courageous, be brave. I dare you.
I accept. As a result of me listening to you, I'm going to be more courageous, more brave. And I invite everybody who's listening to this podcast to take this to the heart, because I think this is one of the qualities that we all need nowadays. And once again, Kasper, thank you so much for your insight. Thank you so much for your wisdom. And to the audience, I think this was one of these beautiful podcasts when you can listen again and again and again and really hear the deep level of wisdom and knowledge, and also practical skills and tools that you might receive from listening to elevate yourself to the next level of leadership and to help you become a better human being. So thank you so much for tuning in today. Once again, Kasper, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. We look forward to having you once again. Thank you.
Thank you.